Welcome to the Environmental Justice Lab. I'm your host, Dr. Leslie Joseph. Thank you so much for joining me. And we are still talking about environmental apartheid. I don't know if you've been keeping up with the episodes. If you've been listening, I hope you have been. But we have been going through different aspects of environmental apartheid. First, starting with climate apartheid, moving to the last few episodes on food apartheid. And now we are talking about infrastructure apartheid. Infrastructure apartheid. It is something that is starting to gain some momentum and some understanding, but I think it's important to really highlight and just bring to the surface what is really going on here when it comes to infrastructure and how things are built, how resources are distributed, how we as a society decide who gets what and what access is made available to which residents wherever they live. And it all starts with the infrastructure. It's the kind of thing that everybody wants to talk about. All the politicians, all of the business people, all of the corporations, industry, always talking about infrastructure. We need more infrastructure, better infrastructure, more access to high quality infrastructure. And you know what? I agree with them wholeheartedly. We need better infrastructure. Every couple of years, the American Society of Civil Engineers releases an infrastructure report card, and it's never good. It's never something that you'd want to have for your report card if you were in school. Lots of C's, lots of D's, D minuses, maybe a couple of B's, but it's very rare because everybody understands that we need better infrastructure. We just need it. It needs to be improved, needs to be maintained, and it needs to be accessible to everyone. But what people don't mention is that there are very distinct, very deliberate disparities in the infrastructure that is currently available. So when people talk about the fact that we need better infrastructure or that our grades are failing on the infrastructure front, they would have you to believe that it's consistently bad across the board, that it's consistently a problem everywhere you look, and that we need to improve all of our infrastructure everywhere in order to maximize what's possible. But as you might know from the series we've been doing, there are very specific, deliberate, intentional differences in the quality of infrastructure that is available depending on who you are and where you live. It's very clear. Certain residents have higher quality infrastructure and certain residents don't. Even the way we talk about infrastructure, you can tell the difference, right? So you might live on the quote unquote wrong side of the tracks, right? The idea that this railroad track divides your community and you can live on the good side or the bad side, right? I mean, that's how we talk about it. We can talk about whether or not you can actually get to one part of town or the other. Is there access to transportation, access to decent roads, a rail system, a subway system, anything that can help you travel from one place to another? You know, you might live on that side of town that doesn't have a subway station, a bus stop, a railway depot, nothing like that. And so these differences are not coincidental. These differences are not an accident. These are deliberate, systemic disparities as it relates to infrastructure. And we are going to talk about it on this episode today. So I'm glad you're here. Please stay tuned. This is the Environmental Justice Lab. Welcome to the Environmental Environmental Justice Lab. I am Dr. Joseph. Thank you for listening. And today we are all about infrastructure and infrastructure apartheid. That's what we're talking about. And before we get into the discussion about apartheid and how it looks and how it's manifesting itself, let's just talk a little bit about infrastructure, because we all need it. We all rely on it, and we all depend on it for our well-being, for our ability to be productive citizens, to participate in society. We need infrastructure. A lot of people think about infrastructure only as a certain type of building or a certain type of piece of equipment, but infrastructure is everything that helps make a society function and operate. It's from the buildings to the roads to the bridges to the water and sewer systems to the electrical grid to internet, broadband access, to the ability to go to a park, to a library, your schools. These are all elements of infrastructure that are necessary for communities and for cities and states to thrive and to be productive and to be recognized as places where you want to live and raise a family. You need infrastructure to do that, right? I got this quote, and it's a very important quote because it really encapsulates what infrastructure is and what it does. It says infrastructure can play an important role in social inclusion and economic growth. However, when it's inadequate, it can lead to social exclusion, poverty, and poor health. And so that is how important infrastructure is to any society. The first thing you do if you want to build a city, to have a place to live, have a community, is you have to put in infrastructure. You have to put in place systems that allow people to meet and greet one another, engage their services, their skills, and use them to improve and uplift wherever they are. It takes infrastructure to do that. And when you have, like we have in our country and in our world, infrastructure apartheid, you have a system where there are different tiers depending on who you are and where you live that dictate the type and availability of infrastructure, which would allow you to have that community to be engaged socially and economically and politically and academically and intellectually. You need infrastructure to do that. And depending on where you live, you might not have it. And hence the term infrastructure apartheid. Now, that term, I didn't come up with it. So it's not my term. The first time I heard this term, it was in a lecture by Dr. Maya Carrasquillo from the University of California, Berkeley. She is an environmental engineering professor there. She gave an amazing talk about infrastructure apartheid. And from that moment, I said, oh, this is something that's been happening all over for a very long time. And so she defines infrastructure apartheid this way. She calls it the systemic dehumanization through material and social entities that are observed, felt, and lived across racial, economic, and geographic spatialization. It's a long definition. But what she's essentially saying is infrastructure apartheid is when you dehumanize certain groups of people using material things, social entities, elements of a society that you can feel, see, and experience. And you're dehumanizing along racial lines, economic lines, and geographic lines. So it's not just that some people have it and some people don't, but it's the reality that the people who have it are specifically a certain type of people. They're usually urban, they're usually wealthier, higher income, and they're usually white. These are the people who have access to the infrastructure and the high quality systems necessary to be highly productive, highly engaged in their societies, in their cities. Whereas if you're lower income, if you're rural, black, brown, different ethnic groups, you will experience your infrastructure differently. Lower quality, less availability, limited access. And that, as Dr. Carrasquillo would say, is a form of systemic dehumanization. It's not just that you don't have what you need, it's that you're being treated less than a human by not being provided that, because it's something that's given and set up by the people who make decisions and the people who are in power. It is not a situation where you just found yourself in a place that happened to lack certain amenities and certain services. You are being systemically dehumanized because of it, because people can provide those services if they so choose. Your elected officials can create avenues for you to have those services if they so choose, but they chose otherwise. They said, you know what, we're going to invest and spend our time and money over there and not over here. And it was deliberate. It was very intentional. It was not an accident. And so that's when you have infrastructure apartheid. When you have quite literally tiers, levels of quality and access based on your racial identity, based on your income status, based on your geographic location. That is infrastructure apartheid. That is what's happening. And we see it. You feel it. You know it. Everybody, whether they want to acknowledge it or not, understands wherever you live that there are certain places you can go where everything is really nice. The water tastes better. The roads are smoother and cleaner. The parks are bigger and better. The school system, the supermarkets, like we talked about last time, supermarkets, grocery stores are better, nicer. The air is cleaner. Everything is better over there. And then when you come over here to where we live, to where we grew up, why are there so many potholes in the road? Why is the air so dirty? Why are our parks run down? The basketball goals are bent and leaning over. The tennis courts have big cracks and the nets are broken and torn to pieces. The play sets, like they were built in the 80s. Why is that? Well, it's apartheid. It's infrastructure apartheid. That's what it is. That's how you identify and understand that situation, because I promise you that if you look different, if you had a different income status, made a little more money, had a white collar job, lived closer in the city, you would have much better infrastructure. But you don't, because decisions were made to not provide that for you and to provide it for others in other places. Infrastructure apartheid. That's what it is. And that's how it needs to be understood. I read this amazing essay called Infrastructure, Inequality, and the Neo-Apartheid City. So these writers are talking about an apartheid city where the city is just set up with this apartheid system fully in place. And they go through it. They say, look, water and sewer and access to services like healthcare are essential to the health and well-being of the residents, right? They acknowledge that. They continue, housing and transportation affect everyday relationships mobility and exchanges between neighborhoods correspond to a hierarchy of identities, which determine your political and social rights and your access to basic political channels. Their argument is the way that your homes and your transportation systems are set up affect how you live from day to day and how you relate to people, and they are directly related to how you would identify yourself or how the decision makers identify you when they put those things in place. And those identities will determine the degree of rights that you have and access to systems that you could enjoy in that city. And so they talk about an apartheid city, right? An urban system of division, which divides communities. And it is built on inequity and built on a dehumanization of others. In this apartheid city that they're describing in this essay, that's what's happening. That's the reality. And so I don't want anyone to think that for some reason you were just dealt a bad hand or that you were just unlucky in where you live and what you're experiencing. The truth is, now see, okay, so now I'm a Christian now, so I have to tell you why I think this way. It's because I know for a fact that we're all created in God's image and that God has not created any hierarchies or any levels based on your identity or your social status. We're all equal. We're all made in his image according to his likeness. And so as a result of that, the fact that your skin looks different than mine, you make more money than me, I make less money than you, has no bearing on what we should enjoy as people living on this planet. And so the reason that we have these divisions and we have this inequity, we have this apartheid system is because people have decided that you're not going to be worth the investment. You're not going to be worth the time that it takes to build up a community that you would find joy and pleasure in. People have decided that, and they've chosen other people to provide that to based on how they look and what their status is. That's what's happened. And in this apartheid city, you have the different elements, the different people living in this city experiencing infrastructure different ways because of how that city was built up and planned and developed. That's what it is. And that is how you should understand that. And so the question that I have is, okay, we're talking about it. So we're talking about it in theory. We're talking about it, in the abstract. Are there any examples of this on the ground? Well, yes, there are. There are plenty of examples. I'll give you just a few from the United States and a couple of other countries just to get you to feel what this is like when it actually occurs in real life. So in the United States, we have this huge interconnected interstate system. We have 48 states on the continental US and there's 2 others outside, and we have interstates that connect all the states together. It was a huge deal when they started in the 50s. The 1956 National Interstate Highway Act, it passed and it authorized the construction of all of these major interstates across the country, 41,000 miles of them. But guess what? They started building them. Where did they put these roads? Where did they actually build these interstates? No surprise. They put them straight through Black communities, straight through underserved areas, straight through the marginalized in America at that time. And so these communities had to get up and move, or they were split in 2 or 3 ways to make room for these interstates to be built. An estimate from the Center of American Progress says that in the first 2 decades, the construction of this interstate system displaced 475,000 families and displaced over 1 million people of color to make these interstates a reality. It's apartheid. Why are they the ones who have to bear the brunt of the construction of this system that is meant to bring states together and facilitate more economic activity, more travel, more development? Why? Because of what the definition says at the beginning of the episode: systemic dehumanization. Dehumanization. You are not viewed the same as someone else when you are subjected to these types of discriminatory practices and activities. You're not valued when this happens. And of course, that's just one element, right? When we built all the airports throughout the country, where were they placed? You might think, oh, they were placed out in the field where nobody was living. Well, that's not true. And even if it were true, the rural parts of America are just as important as the urban ones. So why would you build stuff there disproportionately? It's infrastructure apartheid, communities of color, rural areas. All these places were the ones where airports were placed versus displacing wealthier, whiter residents. Why not go there? It's apartheid. It's apartheid. That's all it is. Plain and simple. Right? Think about the quality of the roads and the bridges, even in America. Very different depending on where you live. And there have been numerous studies done to show the impact of the condition of roads on communities of color, Black neighborhoods versus more affluent white neighborhoods. I have an amazing collaborator at the University of Massachusetts at Amherst, and she did a study of the road condition, the pavement condition across Massachusetts. And she looked at the quality of the roads in what she called environmental justice communities, which is what we're talking about on the podcast, and non-EJ communities, the richer, whiter ones. And she found clear disparities in the condition of the roads in these EJ communities versus the non-EJ communities. Why is that? Is it just a coincidence that they just happen to have the majority of the poor roads in their neighborhoods? It's not a coincidence. It's infrastructure apartheid. It's a deliberate attempt to disparage one community and uplift another. It happens all the time. The same thing with the water system. Same thing with the sewer systems. So many studies have gone out and looked at where flooding happens when it rains. That's an infrastructure issue. People look at sanitary sewer overflows. If you don't know what that is, that's when during a rainstorm, water can get into your sewer system. And because sewer systems aren't designed to carry rainwater, they overflow because it's too much water in the system. It's only meant to cover sewer and wastewater, not wastewater and rainwater. But because it gets in, because the pipes are such poor quality or not maintained, the rainwater gets in, fills up the pipes, and then you run out of room and water comes out of manholes and you have sewage going in the streets. In these low-income communities, in these communities of color, it's not a coincidence that this is the case. This is infrastructure apartheid at its finest. This is how it looks. And there's plenty of other examples in the US of infrastructure apartheid. So many. Let's move out. South Africa is always the country that is pointed to when the word apartheid comes up, right? They famously had a government sanctioned apartheid system, and apartheid is an Afrikaans word for separateness and division. Like, that is what it is. And you could say they are the ones who pioneered the systemic apartheid regimes that people don't want to see replicated across the world. And so, even as recently as a couple of years ago in South Africa, even though the apartheid system was dismantled, even though there's more integration, there are more unified groups working for equality, there's still these elements of apartheid existing. And in this study, the researchers identified what they called green apartheid, which was the idea that the green infrastructure was distributed in discriminatory ways across South Africa, right? They're talking about parks and green spaces, trees, having more trees in more affluent neighborhoods, fewer trees in less affluent neighborhoods, or no trees at all, right? That is a big difference between what you would find in these richer, whiter neighborhoods than what you would find in these black neighborhoods. And they're calling it green apartheid. And so even now, we have, in South Africa at least, according to these researchers, elements of apartheid still present. And in this case, it's infrastructure apartheid that is still present in South Africa, right? So if you do what I did and you look up infrastructure apartheid, you'll get lots of examples from the United States, lots of examples from actual apartheid regimes that occurred, and you have to keep digging, and you'll find that there's still some present today. It's still a problem today. And so that's in South Africa. Another place where infrastructure apartheid is clear, is present, and it's damaging is in the occupied Palestinian territories, right? The West Bank, Gaza. There's a war going on there, so everybody's kind of paying a little bit more attention. But for decades, discriminatory practices, subjugation, dehumanization has been what's occurred in these territories. And there was a very comprehensive, very thorough investigation done by Amnesty International. And the title was very simple. It just says, Israel's Apartheid of Palestinians. It doesn't say anything about who should have what state or what kind of arrangement should we have. And they don't care about that. I don't care about it either, to be honest. Like, I'm not worried about any political settlements in the Middle East in terms of how land is distributed or managed or maintained. My concern is, are we all being treated equally with whatever situation, whatever setup we choose to have? Whatever you choose to have, does it result in everyone being treated fairly and equally? And right now, it's just not the case. It is just not the case. And so in this report, Amnesty International says that millions of Palestinians live in densely populated areas that are underdeveloped and lack essential services, garbage collection, electricity, water, sanitation, public transportation. They just don't have it. It's just not there at all in these areas, in the West Bank, in East Jerusalem. Definitely not in Gaza, not at this point. There's almost nothing there. And so, what would you call that? What would you call a situation where a certain group of people have and a certain group of people don't have? Well, you would call it infrastructure apartheid. That's just what you would have to call it because that's what it is. And it's been like that for decades and decades. I don't know the full history. I wish I did. Hopefully one day I'll do the research and really learn more about how we got to this point. But right now, 2024, this is where we are. This is what we have. We have Palestinian territories that are occupied by the nation of Israel. That's just a fact. No one can dispute it. Under international law, the Palestinian territories are where the Palestinians live, but it's being occupied by a foreign government, Israel. Okay. How are they being treated? That's the question. Well, we know now, and we've known for a long time, that they're treated differently. Here's another statement from the report from Amnesty International. It says that Palestinians across all the areas under Israel's control have fewer opportunities to earn a living wage and engage in business when compared to Jewish Israelis. They experience discriminatory limitations on access to farmland, water, natural resources like gas and oil reserves, and restrictions on healthcare services and education. These are all infrastructure components that lead to thriving communities. And this report clearly says that they are not able to have full access to them. Meanwhile, people who are Israeli, who are Jewish, do have access to them. There's no other way to describe it but infrastructure apartheid. And you know what's even worse? This is what's really interesting. So you might want to say, well, the Palestinian territories need to be governed better. The Israeli government is taking care of its people. And that's what they should do. Palestinians should take care of their people and have governance that works for all the people that live there. And then we can resolve this. It's not really Israel that's responsible for getting Palestinians access to these kinds of infrastructure systems that help. And you might think that, you might believe that, but if you're occupied, the person doing the occupying is responsible for the well-being of those under its occupation. That's just a law. You have to be mindful of the fact that if you're going to occupy a land, no matter who you are or where you are, you have to take care of the people under your occupation, especially if it's a military occupation of a civilian population. You have to take care of them. That's the first thing. The second thing is, we haven't talked about this yet, but there are people who are Israeli, Jewish Israelis, settling in the occupied territories, building homes. They have settlements, different neighborhoods that are exclusively for Israeli citizens that are in the occupied territories. And so you would say, well, why would you want to live there? They don't have access to anything. No access to water, sanitation, trash collection, nothing. You're going to live there? Why? Go live somewhere else where there is access. Live in a nicer neighborhood inside Israel so you can get what you really want. The truth is, the Israeli government builds the settlements in these occupied territories. They build the infrastructure for those settlements in the occupied territories, and they facilitate the travel between those territories and the nation of Israel for its citizens as they live in those occupied territories. The same infrastructure that is not made available to Palestinians that live there, not made available to those under its occupation. And so there's no other way to describe it but infrastructure apartheid. There's no other way to describe it except that the people who are governing the activities and who are responsible for distributing resources across Israel and across the occupied territories have decided we're going to provide those resources for these types of people and not those types of people. For whatever reason. The reason is clear that if you're Palestinian, you will not have access. But if you are Israeli, you will have access. I'm saying everyone should have access. Everyone should have the opportunity to enjoy clean water, to have sanitation services, to have their trash picked up and disposed of, to have high quality education, to have high quality roads, and to be able to move from place to place. Everyone should have that. I don't believe in any kind of two-tiered system of operating. And so when it comes to this idea of infrastructure apartheid, I have to tell you that is damaging to everyone. It dehumanizes one group. It cuts off the other group from accessing the talent and resources and the skill that comes from that dehumanized group. And it divides communities, it divides societies, it creates conflict, it creates instability, and it creates insecurity among all the people everywhere. It's a really bad situation when you have these apartheid systems continuing, especially in these developed countries where you know that there's resources available to bring equity and to bring justice and to bring equality to everyone that lives there. It shouldn't happen anywhere. It shouldn't happen in Israel. It shouldn't happen in occupied territories. It shouldn't happen in South Africa. It shouldn't happen in the United States. It shouldn't happen anywhere in Europe, anywhere in Eastern Europe, anywhere in Africa. It shouldn't happen anywhere where we have situations where certain higher class people have more access and have all their needs made available to them while the rest just don't. You just don't. That can't happen. And so, it's frustrating to think about the fact that these situations could be easily resolved. In the US, we could easily spend the money to fix the infrastructure in these areas that have poor quality, low access infrastructure. We could easily build up these neighborhoods and avoid having apartheid cities across the world. We could easily avoid that. But it takes an understanding and a view of people that looks at them not just as commodities or objects to be exploited or extracted from or to be neglected and demeaned and dehumanized, but it takes a view that we're all equal. We're all created equal. We all have equal rights and equal access and equal opportunities because of who we are, because of what we want to have in our societies, because of what we imagine our city could become if everyone participated, if everyone was involved, if everyone had same access. We could be so much better, so much further along. There could be a lot less conflict, a lot less war, health issues, economic issues, all these issues. They're coming out of these infrastructure apartheid systems. And when we close those gaps, when we remove those disparities, everyone benefits. Everyone wins in the end when we all have access and we all have opportunities to do what we were put here to do. And so all I'm saying is we need to dismantle these apartheid systems, these infrastructure apartheid systems that would privilege certain communities over others. We need to dismantle the apartheid system that would choose to disintegrate a community of color to put in place infrastructure to benefit a wealthier, wider community. We need to dismantle those things, because until we do, we're going to continue to have all of these disproportionate issues that bring everyone down and that continue to advance and promote and entrench division among all of us. We don't need that. Nobody needs that. What we need is justice and liberty for all. That's what our Pledge of Allegiance says, in America at least, that we want freedom and justice for all. And it starts with making sure our infrastructure is consistently capable of serving everyone and not just some of us. End the infrastructure apartheid that is running rampant across this world. We need to end it. And that's our episode for today. Thank you so much for listening to the Environmental Justice Lab, where we are for the people and for the planet. I will see you next time.